let me point out that in 1965, you had a nationwide network where all major cities contained switches that would enable people to direct dial long-distance calls anywhere in the US and Canada without operator assistance. And at that time, there were no computers, no processors in the network. Imagine a machine intelligent enough to do that, to be able to connect you to any telephone, to translate the number you dial, to route the call through the switches of the local switch you're working with, and then arrange for it to be routed through the nationwide network from coast to coast. In 1965, all the equipment necessary is in place and there are no computers in the network. Crossbar 1, or number 1 crossbar, was a switching system developed by the Bell system, first installed in the late 1930s. The last new crossbar 1 prefix we knew about was in 1972. By 1990, they had all been retired. This presentation begins with a tape that Ben recorded in 1974 from his home phone in Bell Harbor, Queens, Neptune 4. And this office is a very good representative of the older sound of crossbar 1. Now there's another type of crossbar 1 register sender which gives a very different sound than this, and where you can hear the outpulsing very clearly, and I'll do that in a separate presentation. There were a lot of offices in Manhattan that had that newer sound. But this is the crossbar 1 sound that we grew up with, so to speak. My hometown in Long Island had one of these too, although I had a new dial tone. And this tape was made while the wonder of the telephone network was still fresh for us. I'm going to splice in some material from later times, but only where that material is the same as it would have sounded at the time that he made these tapes. The reason being that some of the material he recorded wasn't of the same quality recording as we later made with a different recording method. You'll notice that the dial tone has a different pitch on certain calls. The higher pitched dial tone is correct, it's just that that day, his dial tone in Bell Harbor, the machine was running a little fast.
Okay, this is Friday, May 24th, 1974, and we're going to do routings for my 634 crossbar 1 exchange. Okay, we'll do, starting off, direct trunks to panel.
Here's the explanation of number 5 crossbar that Martin gave me at the Telephone Museum in Ellsworth, Maine. As this conversation begins, we are standing looking at part of the wall that contains the master test frame. I don't know what that part is called. It's the front of the office. It's always the thing you see in front. And there is this panel of lights that has cryptic letters under each light, and what it shows is how far the most recent call that was flagged for trouble progressed. In the last segment, we were using the Fairview Avenue panel to make long-distance calls to York, Pennsylvania's area. The call goes through Forest Hills,
21233,
New York 4,
2122,
which dial pulses to the York, Pennsylvania step tandem.
7179.
And you do get to hear the dial pulsing because New York 4 is a 4M, and the peculiarity of 4Ms is that you hear the dial pulsing when they dial pulse out. Here's one more to York, Pennsylvania. These calls were recorded from Charlie's house, and Charlie also has a number one crossbar line. Now, the differences between panel and number one crossbar are quite significant, but when you call long distance, well, let's just make a similar call to York, Pennsylvania from the Fairview Avenue crossbar 1. Yes, that was a completely different switching system. When you pick up the phone and you call long distance, the two sound so much alike, and yet if you were actually in the central office, listening to the way those two systems sound from the inside, crossbar 1 is noisy as all get out, panel is extremely quiet, and of course the two work completely differently, except if you were to look at a block diagram of the structure of the way the two switches work. In a block diagram, they seem very much the same too. Let's make some more calls from number one crossbar to long distance, and when I get a really good example, I'll stop and explain exactly what the noises mean.
We're sorry. The number you have reached. Please check the number and dial again.
We look back at the 1980s telephone-wise, and we find that, for example, in the Asheboro area, most of the electromechanical entities are still in place. And so it seems like it's still interesting. But from my point of view at the time, it was kind of the opposite, because important parts of the network that made it really wonderful were gone. For example, the carrier systems had all been replaced with T-carrier by that time. The Asheboro step-by-step switch, which was central to the switching network at the time, had been replaced by a DMS, a digital switch. The DMS actually slowed down call completion time between the electromechanical offices I was interested in. It also made it impossible to dial through it, so that if I wanted to find out, for example, if Randleman's toll trunks could be accessed through the outside, I couldn't do it anyway. So I didn't like the DMS. However, thanks to the fact that Northern Telecom didn't like to provide helpful software assistance involving their DMS, forcing the phone companies to do everything in sort of a one-size-fits-all kind of way, well, a situation was created in Asheboro where if you had a 625 number served by the Pentaconta, you could make free phone calls to anywhere in the United States and Canada as long as you had a particular device. And what illicit, underground, shady device was this that allowed you to make free phone calls all over North America? Well, I still happen to have one of these illicit devices right here. It's, a rotary dial telephone. And all anyone needed to do with that rotary dial phone was to call Aunt Gertrude in Seagrove, not hang up quite long enough to disconnect the call completely, and then dial whatever number you wanted anywhere in North America, and it would go through for free and not make a record of the call. I think I'm the only person, however, that discovered this, and I never told anybody. And while it was surprising and it made me laugh to find it, it didn't really mean anything to me because I was paying for my phone calls by that point, and the network in which it occurred was a network, to me, of deterioration. In fact, by 1986, my interest in phones was dead. To do a phone trip was kind of an obligatory review